Operation Barbarossa, launched on June 22, 1941, was Hitler's audacious plan to conquer the Soviet Union. With over 3 million soldiers, it was the largest military invasion in history. The objective was to crush the Red Army, seize vital resources, and secure Lebensraum for the German people. Initially, the Germans enjoyed rapid success, using their Blitzkrieg tactics to advance deep into Soviet territory. Yet, as they approached Moscow, the Soviet resistance grew, turning what was supposed to be a quick victory into a brutal, prolonged conflict. As the sun rose on June 22, 1941, a seismic shift in global warfare occurred. Adolf Hitler unleashed Operation Barbarossa, a campaign designed to crush the Soviet Union and expand Nazi dominion eastward. Named after the medieval Holy Roman Emperor Frederick Barbarossa, the operation was Hitler's most ambitious military endeavor and, arguably, his greatest gamble. The stakes were monumental. For Hitler, the Soviet Union represented not only a threat but a potential utopia for the Third Reich. A swift and decisive victory would secure vital resources: Ukraine's vast agricultural plains, the Caucasus oil fields, and much-needed industrial output, all of which would fuel the Nazi war machine in its quest for European dominance. But more than material gain, Operation Barbarossa was rooted in a deeply ideological struggle. Hitler saw the Soviet Union as a bastion of Bolshevism, a system that he despised as much as he did the Jewish people. The invasion was not only about conquest, but also about Lebensraum, the living space Hitler believed was necessary for the survival and expansion of the Aryan race. In his twisted worldview, the Soviet Union and its people were to be enslaved or eradicated, making way for a greater Germany. With over 3 million Axis soldiers, 600,000 vehicles, 4,000 aircraft, and 7,000 artillery pieces, Operation Barbarossa was the largest invasion in human history. The German forces were divided into 3 groups: Army Group North, tasked with taking Leningrad; Army Group Center, aimed directly at Moscow; and Army Group South, targeting the rich farmlands and resources of Ukraine and eventually the Caucasus. Each group had specific objectives, and all 3 were expected to achieve rapid success through the application of the Blitzkrieg strategy, a combination of rapid armored assaults, mechanized infantry, and coordinated air support that had overwhelmed much of Europe. In the early days, the plan seemed to be working. The Soviet forces, despite the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, were caught off guard. Stalin, having trusted Hitler's non-aggression agreement, had left his western borders poorly defended. The Soviet military structure was in disarray following Stalin's brutal purge of military leadership in the 1930s, which had decimated the Red Army's officer corps. As the Germans advanced, encirclement battles like those at Bialystok, Minsk, and Smolensk resulted in catastrophic losses for the Soviet Union. In the first few weeks alone, the Germans captured or killed over 600,000 Soviet troops, leaving behind a trail of destruction. In the north, Army Group North rapidly advanced toward Leningrad, laying siege to the city by September. In the south, Army Group South captured Kiev after a massive encirclement and destroyed large sections of the Red Army, but the true prize, Hitler believed, lay in the capture of Moscow, the political and industrial heart of the Soviet Union. The speed and ferocity of the German assault stunned Stalin. For weeks, he remained paralyzed by indecision, convinced that the Germans would not commit such a large force to an invasion. But as the scope of the attack became clear, Stalin took control of the situation, demanding that no ground be surrendered to the invaders. His orders were brutal but effective. Scorched earth tactics were employed, destroying infrastructure, railways, factories, and farmland, denying the Germans the ability to sustain themselves on Soviet resources. Despite the devastation, the Germans continued their advance. Army Group Center pushed toward Moscow, but in a critical moment, Hitler ordered a diversion of resources to Army Group South to capture Ukraine and secure the industrial cities like Kharkov and the strategic Crimea. This delay, though tactically advantageous in the south, would have catastrophic consequences for the push toward Moscow. As summer turned to fall, the German advance slowed. The vast distances and poor infrastructure of the Soviet Union, combined with the scorched earth tactics, stretched German supply lines to the breaking point. Soldiers and tanks that had previously swept across Europe now found themselves bogged down in the muddy expanses of the Russian Rasputitsa, the autumn rains that by the end of 1941, the rapid German advance had stalled. The onset of the brutal Russian winter, combined with Stalin's scorched earth policy, left the Germans struggling to maintain their offensive. The Soviets, bolstered by new troops and fortified by winter, launched a massive counterattack in December 1941, pushing the Germans away from Moscow. The failure to capture the Soviet capital marked the first major German defeat, and the myth of Nazi invincibility began to crumble. Operation Barbarossa had become a costly war of attrition. By the time the German forces resumed their push toward Moscow in October 1941, winter had arrived early. The Russian winter would become the Germans' most formidable opponent. Hitler, confident that the war would be over before the end of the year, had not prepared his troops for the extreme cold. As temperatures dropped to -30, the Wehrmacht, ill-equipped for winter warfare, began to suffer. Frostbite and hypothermia ravaged the ranks, while fuel shortages left tanks and trucks immobile. The Luftwaffe, previously dominant, could no longer maintain air superiority due to mechanical failures caused by the freezing conditions. Yet, the Germans pressed on. The drive toward Moscow, known as Operation Typhoon, aimed to deliver a knockout blow before the onset of winter. The Germans came within 30 kilometers, 18 miles of the Soviet capital, with German artillery close enough to hear the sounds of Moscow's factories. But in these final, desperate weeks, the Soviet Union unleashed its own secret weapon, General Winter. In December 1941, the Soviet Union launched a massive counteroffensive, spearheaded by fresh divisions from Siberia, troops specially trained for winter warfare. These divisions had been freed from the Soviet Far East after Stalin was assured that Japan engaged in its own conquests in the Pacific would not attack. Under the leadership of General Georgy Zhukov, a commander known for his resilience and strategic brilliance, the Red Army struck back fiercely. Soviet forces, bolstered by tens of thousands of new recruits and large numbers of T-30 for tanks, began a determined defense of their homeland. Zhukov's defensive lines around Moscow were fortified by hastily erected barricades and trench systems, while his reserves launched a ferocious counterattack, pushing the Germans back from the city. The effect was immediate. The exhausted and freezing German soldiers, already at the limit of their endurance, were driven back in a chaotic retreat. Stalin, emboldened by the success, demanded that no retreat be allowed on the Soviet side. The Red Army had suffered immense losses, but they were fighting for survival, and the Soviet Union was throwing every available resource into the defense of its capital. For the Germans, the retreat from Moscow marked the first major defeat of the war. Hitler, who had been so sure of victory, now found his army trapped in the quagmire of the Eastern Front. His decision to divert forces to the south had allowed Stalin the time to fortify Moscow and prepare for the counteroffensive. Moreover, the Germans had underestimated the Soviet industrial machine. Factories relocated to the Ural Mountains were producing weapons and supplies at a staggering rate, and the Red Army was being rebuilt from the ground up. Operation Barbarossa had failed to deliver the quick, decisive victory that Hitler had envisioned. The German army, once feared across Europe, now found itself locked in a brutal, grinding war of attrition. The vastness of the Soviet Union, the resilience of its people, and the unforgiving Russian winter had combined to thwart Hitler's plans for conquest. The Eastern Front, which Hitler had expected to be the site of his greatest triumph, would instead become the graveyard of his ambitions. By the end of 1941, 750,000 German soldiers had been killed, wounded, or captured, and the Red Army had begun its long, bloody push westward. The failure of Barbarossa marked the beginning of the end for Nazi Germany. The Eastern Front would continue to absorb millions of lives over the next for years, but the momentum had shifted. Hitler's dream of a vast German empire stretching across the Eurasian steppe had been dashed against the walls of Moscow, and the Soviet Union had proved itself as a colossus that would not be easily subdued. The aftermath of Barbarossa set the stage for some of the most brutal battles in human history, including the Siege of Leningrad, the Battle of Stalingrad, and the eventual fall of Berlin. What had started as a campaign of lightning war had devolved into a protracted struggle that would sap the strength of the German military and ultimately contribute to the collapse of the Third Reich.
All right, get ready for a wild one today because we're diving into Operation Barbarossa, which was Hitler's insane gamble to conquer the Soviet Union.
Yeah, Operation Barbarossa.
It's June 22nd, 1941. The world is already at war, but this is going to make things get a whole lot bigger and a whole lot more brutal.
Yeah, June 1941. Nobody had any idea.
Nobody had any idea
that the world was about to change.
Exactly. To understand exactly what happened and why, we're turning to this book, The Eastern Front in Flames, specifically a chapter called The Genesis of Barbarossa, which really gets into the why behind Hitler's gamble and how this whole thing unfolded.
It's incredible. It's really one of the most, obviously, World War II is full of these pivotal moments.
Well, absolutely.
But this one is just, it's really incredible.
Just to set the scene here, we're talking about more than 3 million soldiers, thousands of tanks and aircraft, all pointed east towards the Soviet Union.
The scale of it is just, even today, it's almost impossible to comprehend, right?
It really is. And the audacity of Hitler to think that he could conquer a country as massive and as geographically challenging as the Soviet Union. What was he thinking?
Well, you have to try to get inside Hitler's head a little bit, which is a scary place to be.
Right, exactly.
But central to his ideology was this idea of Lebensraum, this idea of living space for the German people.
Okay, Lebensraum, right?
Right, and he saw the vast territories of the Soviet Union as this basically empty canvas, right for the taking.
Right, to be absorbed into his whole vision of a greater German Reich.
Exactly. And it fed into his hatred of Bolshevism, right?
Yeah.
He saw the Soviet Union as this, existential threat.
Right, this ideological enemy.
Exactly, to the very soul of, Western civilization as he saw it.
It's amazing how one person's ideology can have such a massive impact.
It's terrifying, really, when you think about it, the power of just an idea.
Right, but it wasn't just this ideological crusade.
No.
This was also about something much more tangible, resources, right?
Yeah, absolutely. The Soviet Union was a treasure trove of resources.
Shoot.
Oil, food, industrial capacity, everything that the Nazi war machine needed to keep grinding forward.
Because you can't exactly conquer Europe on an empty stomach.
Exactly. So for Hitler, securing these resources, it wasn't just a bonus. It was a necessity if he wanted to achieve his grand vision.
Okay, so that makes sense from a strategic point of view, but there's this huge, and literally huge, red flag here.
Okay.
The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact.
Ah, yes.
This non-aggression pact between Hitler and Stalin. Two dictators shaking hands, signing a piece of paper, and then just a couple years later, Hitler breaks it. How can he justify that?
Yeah, you're right. It was a huge betrayal, and really, it just showed the world that Hitler's word, any agreement he made, was essentially meaningless.
So basically, Stalin was completely blindsided by this.
You can't trust Hitler, but yeah, the impact was huge. Yeah. It destroyed whatever trust Stalin thought they had, and it completely messed up any preparations they might have been making.
He was completely unprepared.
Yeah, and to make matters worse, this is also right after Stalin's purges of the Red Army.
Oh, man.
He wiped out a lot of his most experienced commanders because, Stalin.
Right, paranoia.
Exactly. So the Red Army is disorganized, leaderless, and completely unprepared for what's about to hit them.
Which, as we know, is going to be the German Blitzkrieg.
Right. Yeah. Talk about bad timing, right?
The worst.
The worst possible time for Stalin to let his guard down, if you can even call it that.
I mean, talk about walking into a buzzsaw.
Exactly. They had no idea what was coming, which is exactly what made the German attack so devastating.
And that is where we are going to have to leave it for today.
Oh, man. A cliffhanger.
Cliffhanger. But don't worry, we'll be back soon to delve into the full horror of Operation Barbarossa. Until then, stay curious.
And that is exactly what happened. June 22nd, 1941, Operation Barbarossa kicks off.
So the invasion begins. Paint the picture for us. How massive is this thing?
It's hard to wrap your head around it, honestly.
Yeah.
A line of German troops and tanks stretching over 1,800 miles.
Oh my gosh.
The largest invasion force in history, and Stalin, the Soviets, they're caught totally off guard.
It's like something out of a movie.
It really is, except it's all too real. Army Group North, they're headed for Leningrad.
Right.
Army Group Center has its sights set on Moscow, and then Army Group South is going straight for Ukraine, the breadbasket of the Soviet Union.
Yeah.
It's a mind-blowing plan.
And their tactic, their strategy, Blitzkrieg, right, lightning war. How did this change the game?
Blitzkrieg was all about speed and shock.
Shock and awe.
You shatter the enemy's lines before they can even react. It worked amazingly well against a slower, unprepared enemy.
Yeah, well,
The Soviets were definitely caught with their pants down.
to say the least.
To say the least, yeah.
Yeah.
We talked about those purges.
Oh, man. Stalin's paranoia, it really crippled the Red Army.
Decapitated almost.
Exactly. They lost so many experienced commanders. That's got to be devastating.
Right, when they needed that strong leadership the most, too. Just a terrible combination of factors for the Soviets.
And, I mean, reading from the Eastern Front in Flames, the Germans took full advantage. Those first battles, Bialystok, Minsk, Smolensk, they were just massacres.
Those first few months were a nightmare for the Soviets.
Hundreds of thousands of soldiers gone, just like that.
Killed or captured, yeah. It seemed to prove everything Hitler had ever believed about the Soviets,
That they were weak.
and that the German army was invincible.
So Hitler's feeling pretty good about himself, right?
You can imagine, yeah.
But there had to be some flaws, some kinks in the armor.
Oh, there were. And they were about to become very, very apparent.
Because you just don't waltz into Russia, not with those distances, that terrain. You
Yeah.
can't just blitzkrieg your way through everything.
Hitler was about to learn that the hard way.
Yeah.
He'd conquered most of Europe, but Russia was a whole different beast.
It's like trying to conquer the ocean.
Exactly. And the further those German troops pushed, the more they ran into these logistical nightmares. You need those supply lines for a blitzkrieg.
Yeah.
But how do you keep them going when they're stretched thousands of miles?
And then winter hit. Not just any winter, either. We're talking about the legendary Russian winter.
Yeah, it's the kind of cold that gets into your bones.
I can't even imagine.
Temperatures dropping to 30 below, sometimes even colder.
Brutal.
And the Germans, they just weren't ready for it.
It's kind of ironic, right?
Totally.
These masters of the Blitzkrieg, this lightning war, brought to a standstill by the weather.
It's almost poetic justice, in a way.
It really is. So their vehicles, their equipment, it all just starts falling apart.
Basically, the Eastern Front in Flames has some pretty harrowing descriptions of what it was like for the German troops. They were freezing, their equipment was malfunctioning, their vehicles wouldn't start. Everything that made the Blitzkrieg so effective, the speed, the mobility, it all just vanished.
And in the middle of all this, the Soviets mount this incredible comeback. How did they manage to turn the tide like that?
Well, while the Germans are freezing, fresh Soviet troops start pouring in from the east. Siberian troops.
Siberian troops, so they're used to this kind of weather.
Exactly. These guys were born for this kind of fight.
Wow.
They knew the terrain, they had the right equipment, and they were incredibly motivated.
I bet this wasn't just some faraway battlefield for them. This was their homeland.
Exactly. And leading the charge is this, he's almost a legend at this point, General Zhukov.
Zhukov, yeah.
Brilliant strategist,
Yeah.
understood the terrain, knew exactly how to exploit the weaknesses of the German Blitzkrieg. Just an incredible military mind.
So under his command, the Red Army launches a counteroffensive.
And it takes the Germans completely by surprise.
I bet it did.
They were expecting a swift victory, a knockout blow.
Like they had in France.
Exactly. But instead, they found themselves bogged down in a brutal war of attrition, a war they were ultimately going to lose.
The Battle of Moscow really was a turning point, wasn't it?
It was a turning point in the war and a real blow to the myth of German invincibility. Up to that point, they'd seemed unstoppable, but in the ruins of Stalingrad, that myth was shattered.
And so, Operation Barbarossa, this gamble for a quick victory, it fails.
Spectacularly.
What are the lasting consequences of Hitler's failure here?
Well, instead of a swift victory, the Eastern Front turns into this grinding war of attrition. It drags on for years, and it absolutely devours German resources and manpower. Millions die on both sides. The human cost is almost too much to bear. The really tragic thing is that so much of it could have been avoided if Hitler had just, listened to reason.
But then again, he was Hitler.
True enough. But still, it's a cautionary tale about the dangers of ideology and the limits of military power.
It really makes you think about the dangers of unchecked ambition.
It does. The decisions of a single person can have ripple effects that last for generations.
Absolutely. And that is where we're going to have to leave it for today.
Until next time.
As always, thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the past. We'll see you next time.
The tide fully turned with the Battle of Stalingrad in 1940 to 1943, where the German Sixth Army was encircled and forced to surrender. This defeat shattered Hitler's ambitions of conquering the Soviet Union and marked the beginning of the German retreat on the Eastern Front. The failure of Operation Barbarossa, intended to bring the Soviet Union to its knees, instead led to a drawn-out conflict that would bleed Nazi Germany's resources dry and contribute to its eventual downfall.